In the summer of 1943, as the air war over Europe intensified into a struggle for the survival of the Reich, German fighter pilots entered the campaign with absolute confidence in one thing. The Bf-109G, the Gustav, was the finest high-altitude interceptor in the world. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated European skies with successive 109 variants, from the Emile over France in 1940 to the Friedrich during the opening stages of the war with the Soviet Union. The Gustav, with its Daimler-Benz DB605A engine, high climb rate, and compact airframe, represented the latest link in a chain of fighters that German pilots believed unbeatable when flown by experienced hands. Intercept reports from mid-1943 show that Jagdgeschwader commanders such as Adolf Galland and Hubertus von Bohnen regarded the Bf-109G2 and G6 as superior to anything the Americans had fielded. P-38s were fast, but sluggish in vertical maneuvers. P-47s were immensely tough, but heavy, slow accelerating, and easily outclimbed at most altitudes. Early P-51A Allison-engined Mustangs, though nimble at low level, were useless above 15,000 feet. Nothing in the American arsenal, German pilots believed, could challenge the Gustav where it mattered most, high above Germany, where the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator formations could be ripped apart by coordinated cannon attacks from elite Jagdgeschwader. This belief shaped every aspect of Luftwaffe strategy. The Luftwaffe did not need to defeat the entire USAAF. It only needed to hold open a window of vulnerability by ensuring that the heavy bombers were unescorted deep inside the Reich. Because the Bf-109G had a combat endurance of roughly 45 to 60 minutes over central Germany, Luftwaffe pilots could climb to 25,000 to 30,000 feet, intercept the bomber stream with multiple attack passes, and disengage before American escort fighters could arrive. The strategy worked throughout early 1943. Even when P-47 units extended their range with drop tanks, their operational radius still ended well short of Berlin, Leipzig, or the synthetic fuel plants that the Reich depended on. As long as the escort gap existed, the Luftwaffe maintained the initiative, and the Gustav remained the undisputed master of the interception battle. By late summer 1943, German pilots spoke of the Bf-109G with something approaching reverence. The G2 variant offered a clean, responsive feel at high altitude. The G6 introduced heavier armament, twin 13mm MG-131 machine guns, and the centerline 20mm MG-151 cannon, giving pilots a single devastating firing window against armored bombers. Some aces flew with gondola cannons under the wings for even greater destructive power. Many Luftwaffe veterans who had survived years of combat believed that the war could still be won if the Gustav and its pilots could bleed the American bomber force faster than the United States could replace it. The airfields at Schiphol, Munster, and Wiesbaden became launchpads for relentless attacks against the deep penetration raids that USAAF planners hoped would cripple German industry. In engagements like Schweinfurt-Regensburg, 17 August 1943, Luftwaffe pilots tore into the bomber stream with a confidence bordering on fury, convinced that no escort fighter could reach them in time to challenge their supremacy. But beneath this confidence lurked early signs of a disaster the Germans did not yet understand. Even before the Mustang appeared in large numbers, Luftwaffe commanders noticed worrying changes in the tempo and scale of the American offensive. Bombers were flying deeper and more frequently. Fighter sweeps by P-47s and P-38s were growing more aggressive, and aerial reconnaissance revealed a troubling new configuration on American airfields in East Anglia, a sleek, laminar-flow wing fighter that looked nothing like the heavy Thunderbolt or twin-engined Lightning. Luftwaffe intelligence initially dismissed it as a limited-range tactical aircraft. After all, the Americans had never fielded a long-range escort. Why start now? That assumption, rooted in years of Luftwaffe experience, was the foundation on which the Germans' confidence in the Bf-109G rested. The Gustav did not need to be a perfect dogfighter, it only needed to be good enough to overwhelm unescorted bombers. And in 1943, nothing suggested that the Americans possessed a fighter capable of flying from England to central Germany, fighting at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, and returning home with fuel to spare. Without that capability, Luftwaffe pilots believed they would always retain their most decisive advantage, the ability to choose when and where to fight. This belief endured right up until December 1943, when the first P-51B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group began escorting B-17s toward Bremen, Kiel, and Hanover. German pilots expecting early contact with Thunderbolts instead found themselves facing a new fighter, sleek, fast, impossibly long-legged, and astonishingly capable at altitude. At first, they assumed it was a limited deployment, a curiosity, another short-range fighter, nothing strategic. But then came January 1944, and February, and March, and with each passing week, more Mustangs appeared, on the Rhine, over Leipzig, near the synthetic fuel plants of Mercerberg, even on the outskirts of Berlin. The realization hit slowly, then all at once. The Bf-109G, once thought unbeatable, was no longer fighting for control of the skies. It was fighting for survival. The fighters the Luftwaffe had mocked as Anglo-American toys were carving into the Reich's air defenses in a way the Germans had never imagined possible. And as Mustang numbers rose, the Gustav's proud era of dominance began to collapse. The first and most devastating shock the Luftwaffe experienced was not the Mustang's speed, its climb rate, or its handling. It was its range. For 4 years, the German air defense system had relied on a simple truth. American fighters could not escort their bombers into the heart of the Reich. That gap, the vast airspace stretching from the Belgian border to central Germany, was the Luftwaffe's hunting ground, a place where the Bf-109G ruled unchallenged. Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, 26, and later 27 formed what amounted to a rotating wall of interceptors, rising from scattered airfields to slash through bomber formations, regroup, rearm, and strike again as long as fuel and ammunition permitted. This system worked because American fighters simply could not reach the battle. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings lacked the legs to escort bombers across the entire route. Even when they used 75 or 108-gallon drop tanks, they could at best accompany the bombers into western Germany, before being forced to turn back. The Luftwaffe timed its interceptions precisely around the escort's withdrawal. Once the P-47s peeled away, the Gustav pilots knew they were free to climb to altitude and attack with impunity. But starting in December 1943, and accelerating rapidly through January 1944, that calculation collapsed. The arrival of the P-51B Mustang, equipped with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650-3 engine and fitted with 75 and later 108-gallon drop tanks, instantly expanded the USAAF's reach. Suddenly, American pilots climbed into cockpits knowing they had the fuel not only to meet the bombers over the channel, but to escort them all the way to the Ruhr, Hanover, Leipzig, and even Berlin. When Luftwaffe radar stations near the Dutch border detected bombers approaching in late December 1943, they expected the usual pattern: P-47s or P-38s engaging along the frontier, followed by a long escort-free march into the interior. But reconnaissance reported something different. American fighters still glued to the bomber stream, not turning back as expected. At first, German commanders assumed this was a fluke, perhaps a single squadron on an unusually short-range assignment. Then, over the following weeks, reports repeated the same phrase: Jagdschutz bleibt. The fighter cover stays. This was more than surprising. It was catastrophic. The German defense system had been built on the principle that the Luftwaffe could mass forces only after escorts departed. Without that window, interception became a suicide mission. Bf-109G pilots already short on fuel could not climb from dispersed airfields, form up, and position themselves for an attack while a swarm of Mustangs prowled overhead. The moment a Gustav attempted to climb through 10,000 or 15,000 feet, a Mustang dropped onto its tail. Two missions in early 1944 demonstrated this new reality with brutal clarity. 11 January 1944, Oschersleben, Halberstadt, Brunswick. A massive raid targeting the German aircraft industry. Luftwaffe fighters attempted their standard tactic, forming large formations ahead of the bombers, but P-51s swept the assembly areas before the Germans could complete their rendezvous. Many 109s were shot down before they even saw a bomber. 6 March 1944, the first Berlin mission. This was the moment the Reich understood the war had changed. More than 800 U.S. bombers escorted deep into Brandenburg by 3 groups of P-51s reached Berlin for the first time. Luftwaffe fighters launched desperate attacks but were outmaneuvered and outnumbered by Mustangs that stayed with the bomber stream from start to finish. Many German pilots returned to base with a single thought dominating their debriefs. Wir können sie nicht mehr isolieren. We can no longer isolate them. The Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, the ability to fight bombers without interference, was gone. The psychological impact was immense. For years, German pilots believed they could dictate the terms of battle, climb when they wished, attack when opportunity appeared, disengage when fuel ran low. Now Mustangs denied them that freedom. Even more terrifying, Mustangs performed fighter sweeps ahead of the bombers, hunting 109s while they were still climbing, destroying German formations before they could even attempt an attack. This was a strategic disaster for the Reich. German aircraft production was rising, but pilot training time was falling drastically, down from 240 hours in 1942 to barely 110 hours by early 1944. Every pilot lost in a climb-out ambush could not be replaced with an equally skilled veteran. The Americans, meanwhile, were gaining experience and improving coordination with each mission. And once the Mustangs demonstrated that they could not only reach Berlin, but control the airspace above it, the Luftwaffe's last hope, holding the heart of Germany safe, was shattered. The escort gap, once their sanctuary, had evaporated. The Bf-109G, once the master of the mid-war air war, had been turned into a defender that could no longer dictate the engagement. What followed in the spring of 1944 was the final blow. German pilots discovered that the Mustang did not just match the 109 in combat, it surpassed it in every performance metric that mattered. The Luftwaffe had lost the advantage of distance. Soon it would lose the advantage of maneuver, altitude, and energy as well. By the spring of 1944, German pilots had accepted the unthinkable. The P-51 Mustang could follow the bombers everywhere. But many still believed that in a pure dogfight, the Bf-109G, especially the G6, G10, and the late-war G14 variants, would hold its own. The 109 had always been deadly in expert hands. It could climb fast, accelerate well in the vertical, and strike with a heavy punch from its MG-131s in 20mm or 30mm cannon. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on these strengths to defeat P-38s and P-47s. But once combat became unavoidable at medium and high altitude, German pilots discovered something far more frightening than the Mustang's range. The P-51 dominated the energy fight. This advantage was not theoretical. It was brutally practical. Every Luftwaffe pilot who fought the Mustang learned the same lesson. The P-51 could dictate the engagement, choosing when to fight, when to withdraw, and when to re-engage, leaving the Bf-109G constantly reacting, never controlling. The first shock came from the Mustang's dive performance. The dive, the Mustang's most lethal weapon. The Bf-109G had a vicious compressibility onset in high-speed dives. Above 750 km/h, the controls stiffened dramatically,
The elevator lost authority, and recovery became dangerous. The P-51, with its laminar flow wing and clean aerodynamic shape, had no such issue. It could dive past 800 kilometers per hour with controllability intact. German pilots quickly learned that any attempt to disengage by diving was suicidal. Mustangs not only followed, they closed rapidly, firing with astonishing accuracy at high speed. Interviews from JG-1 and JG-26 describe P-51 dive attacks as impossible to escape, with entire Schwarme forced to break defense and scatter. Bf-109s could climb, but they could no longer dive to safety. The climb, where the 109 should have won but didn't. On paper, the Bf-109G had a strong climb rate, around 3,700 feet per minute for the lighter G2 and slightly less for the heavier G6 with MG-131s. But tests and combat reports revealed a critical detail. The Mustang sustained climb speeds better at medium and high altitudes due to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. The DB605A engine on the 109G was optimized for medium-altitude performance, excellent from 10,000 to 20,000 feet, but losing efficiency above 23,000 feet. Meanwhile, the Merlin 1653 held horsepower far better above 25,000 feet. This meant that at 10,000 feet, the 109 could match or slightly beat the Mustang. At 20,000 feet, they were nearly equal. At 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the Mustang outclimbed the 109G decisively. This was catastrophic for Luftwaffe interception doctrine, which relied on climbing above bomber formations. Now, German fighters found that Mustangs were already there at altitude, or worse, climbing faster to cut them off. Acceleration and energy retention. Energy retention, the ability to maintain speed while maneuvering, was where the Mustang became nearly unbeatable. The P-51's low-drag design meant it kept kinetic energy through turns in a way the Bf-109 simply could not. German pilots found themselves in a deadly cycle. They turned to avoid a Mustang attack. They bled speed rapidly due to drag and high wing loading. The Mustang retained speed, widened separation, rolled, and came back in with another pass. The 109 pilot had fewer options each time. The Mustang didn't need to outturn the 109. It simply outlasted it in energy. Veteran ace Heinz Barr said it plainly in 1944, "Once a Mustang is behind you, it stays there." The roll fight, the Mustang's unexpected advantage. The Bf-109G had a strong roll rate at high speed, but the P-51BD had a superior instantaneous roll at medium and high speed bands due to its laminar flow wing and improved aileron design. In boom-and-boom combat, roll rate determines who can reposition fastest. Mustang pilots used this to devastating effect. Dive in, shoot, hard roll, dive again, and climb back with superior energy. 109 pilots found themselves repeatedly overshot, outflanked, and outmaneuvered in the rolling vertical space. The turn fight. The myth of the 109's superiority. Many Luftwaffe pilots believed that the 109 would outturn the P-51 at low speeds. This was only true below 12,000 feet and only in tightening, slow-rate turns, maneuvers suicidal in the modern energy fight. In any realistic dogfight above 20,000 feet, the Mustang held the advantage due to its better energy retention and more forgiving stall characteristics. The final blow. High-altitude performance. By 1944, most deep Reich missions occurred at 25 to 30,000 feet. At these altitudes, Merlin superchargers performed superbly. DB605As struggled. Bf-109G6 cockpit visibility worsened. Mustang visibility remained excellent. German pilots climbing toward bomber streams at 27,000 feet found Mustangs there, faster, higher, and waiting with altitude advantage. The strategic implications were devastating. The German verdict. By mid-1944, German aces understood that the energy fight had shifted permanently. One interrogation summary from a captured JG-300 pilot stated, "The Mustang is superior in every respect except climb at low altitude. At combat altitude, it is faster, climbs better, and dives much better. The Bf-109G, once the terror of Europe, could no longer escape, could no longer dictate range, and could no longer impose the vertical fight that had defined Luftwaffe tactics since 1940. The Mustang had stolen the very thing the Luftwaffe depended on most: control of energy, altitude, and initiative.
By April 1944, the air war over Germany had transformed from a defensive campaign into something far more terrifying for the Luftwaffe. The Mustangs were no longer merely escorts, they had become hunters. The shift was sudden, brutal, and unmistakable. For years, Bf-109G units structured their interception doctrine around predictable patterns: climb to altitude, assemble into a swarm or larger storm group of formation, slash through bomber boxes, and then disengage using altitude or dive advantage. But the arrival of large numbers of P-51Bs and, shortly afterward, the iconic P-51D shattered every one of those assumptions. Instead of trailing the bombers, the Mustangs now flew ahead of them, sweeping Luftwaffe assembly areas, ambushing climbing 109s, and denying Germany the ability to mass its fighters. This change, orchestrated by General Jimmy Doolittle in early 1944, meant American fighters were no longer tied to the bomber stream. They were free to roam, free to attack, free to destroy the Luftwaffe before it could even engage. German pilots described the new reality in stark terms. The sky belonged to the Mustangs. The consequences appeared immediately during the February 1944 Big Week attacks against Regensburg, Augsburg, Leipzig, and Schweinfurt. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe attempted to form up in its traditional interception boxes, only to find Mustangs diving down on them before they reached operational altitude. This was not just a tactical shift, it was a psychological warfare. The Luftwaffe's entire aerial doctrine depended on the ability to decide the moment of engagement. The Bf-109G, with its limited fuel and short endurance, required efficient timing: scramble, climb, form up, attack, land. When P-51s swept German airfields, strafed runways, ambushed takeoff climbs, and hovered along ingress routes, all timing collapsed. Instead of disciplined vertical intercepts, the Luftwaffe was forced to launch piecemeal groups, single swarm, lone rotten, and fragmented pairs that lacked the mass and organization to break bomber formations. Many German pilots, especially those of JG-3 and JG-27, described the horror of climbing through 10,000 feet only to see contrails streaking downward toward them. Those contrails belonged to P-51s already at 28,000 feet, controlling the airspace the 109s once considered their own. In these conditions, the strengths of the Bf-109G evaporated. Its climb rate no longer mattered when Mustangs were already at altitude. Its acceleration no longer mattered when Mustangs dictated every head-on pass. Its turning ability no longer mattered when Mustangs refused to engage in slow-radius dogfights. The Luftwaffe tried adapting by using bait tactics, sending a few fighters forward to lure the Mustangs down while the main force climbed. But the P-51's superior range and speed let it maneuver around such traps. Numerous German post-action reports show Mustang groups splitting into high and low elements, trapping Bf-109Gs in vertical scissors from which escape was impossible. The Luftwaffe also attempted mass armored Sturmgruppen attacks, heavily armed FW-190As escorted by Bf-109Gs. These formations were designed to penetrate the bomber boxes with sheer force, but Mustangs intercepted them long before they could close, shredding the escorting 109Gs and leaving the slower 190s exposed. May and June 1944 were the breaking point. As the Allies prepared for D-Day, the 8th Air Force launched relentless pre-invasion sweeps over northern France and western Germany. Mustangs struck airfields at Bonn-Hangelauer, Oldenburg, Juvincourt, and Clermont-Ferrand, destroying dozens of parked aircraft and catching Bf-109s during taxi or takeoff. The Luftwaffe's remaining experten were forced into defensive, reactive flying, exactly the opposite of their standard doctrine. Young German pilots trained with barely 110 to 140 flight hours were thrown into battles dominated by veteran Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. The casualty rate became unsustainable. By the time P-51Ds equipped the bulk of the escort groups, featuring improved visibility, extended range, and better gun sights, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was already cracking. Encounter reports from JG-26 reveal that German pilots saw Mustangs everywhere, above the bombers, below the bombers, sweeping ahead, circling behind,
there was no approach vector left uncovered. Many German pilots stopped climbing altogether, attempting low-level ambushes that often failed due to the Mustang's equal superiority at low altitude. Even the later model Bf-109 G10 and G14, equipped with high-altitude DB605D engines, could not regain the initiative. Their performance improvements were too little, too late, and delivered to a force that no longer had the training or numbers to exploit them. The final collapse came when Mustangs began escorting medium bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and even transport operations. The last German hope that attrition would eventually wear down American air power vanished when waves of fresh P-51s replaced losses within days. Meanwhile, every lost German pilot represented a year of training the Reich could no longer afford. By late 1944, German commanders acknowledged that the Bf-109G, once feared across Europe, had been entirely outclassed. It was not just a matter of performance, it was the fact that the Mustang had destroyed the Luftwaffe's most important asset, the power to choose the fight. German pilots understood they were no longer interceptors, they were prey, and in the cold, thin air over the Reich, the hunters were red and white tails.
By early 1945, as the Reich collapsed and Luftwaffe survivors fell into Allied hands, American intelligence officers conducted a flood of POW interrogations under the APWIU, Allied Prisoner of War Intelligence Unit. These reports, now preserved in U.S. and British archives, reveal a striking unanimity among captured Jagdflieger. The P-51 Mustang had broken the Luftwaffe, not gradually, not symbolically, but decisively and irreversibly. What emerged from these testimonies was not simply admiration for the Mustang's design, but a clear acknowledgement that it had destroyed the fundamental assumptions upon which the Luftwaffe's air doctrine rested. German strategy depended on isolating bombers, massing interceptors, controlling altitude, and choosing engagement windows. The Mustang took each of those pillars and shattered them one by one. The first theme that recurred in interviews was shock at the Mustang's range. Luftwaffe veterans admitted that their entire interception system was built around the escort gap, the safe zone between the limit of P-47 and P-38 coverage and the bomber target areas. Once that gap disappeared, German pilots found themselves under constant threat from takeoff to landing. A pilot from JG-1 stated bluntly, "From January 1944, we were never alone again." Another, from JG-11, told interrogators that the moment Mustangs arrived deep inside Germany, the war became unwinnable. "We could not attack, we could only survive, if lucky." The second recurring theme was respect, bordering on fear for the Mustang's energy superiority. Pilots from JG-3, JG-26, and JG-27 consistently described the same experience. Once a Mustang entered a fight, it controlled everything. The 109G could no longer dive away. It could no longer sustain vertical maneuvers at altitude. It could no longer accelerate clear of danger. POW after POW recounted the same frustration. "We made one evasive turn, but the Mustang made three." Even experienced aces admitted that while they could sometimes escape thunderbolts or lightnings, a determined Mustang pilot was nearly impossible to shake. One Staffelpapitan captured after the Battle of the Bulge summed it up: "The Mustang chose when a fight happened. We chose nothing." A third theme was the collapse of German training when confronted with the Mustang's lethality. By 1944, new Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with barely half the training hours of their predecessors. Against P-47s or P-38s, they might have had a chance to survive long enough to learn. Against P-51s, they died within minutes. Several POWs stated that rookie pilots were often shot down before seeing the enemy, ambushed during climb-out, or caught forming up. Mustang sweeps over airfields, once unimaginable, became daily occurrences, destroying aircraft on the ground and annihilating entire Jagdstaffeln before they reached altitude. But the most devastating admissions came from the Experten, the surviving aces with hundreds of missions. Their testimonies carried an authority born of brutal experience. Many spoke with bitterness, but without denial. One veteran of JG 300 responsible for Reich defense during the worst months of 1944, explained that the Mustang's presence forced German pilots into defensive flying, the opposite of traditional Luftwaffe doctrine. We were hunters, and then suddenly, we were hunted. Another ace described watching his Staffel disintegrate under repeated Mustang dives. They came from above, always above. They stayed above even when we tried to climb. Even the late-war Bf-109 G10 and K4 variants, equipped with the DB605D engine, higher boost, and improved high-altitude performance, could not turn the tide. POWs admitted that these aircraft arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Moreover, they were flown by poorly trained pilots who could not exploit the aircraft's potential. Mustang pilots, by contrast, entered combat with a degree of training consistency, gunnery proficiency, and operational experience the Luftwaffe could no longer match. Intelligence summaries from March and April 1945 included candid assessments that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. POW interrogators recorded quotes such as, "The P-51 was the best fighter of the war. We could not equal it. If we saw Mustangs, we avoided combat unless forced." The war was lost when the bomber stream no longer had weakness. One of the most revealing statements came from a former pilot of JG-1. "You Americans built a fighter that did everything: fast, long-range, high-altitude, and excellent in combat. We had nothing left to answer it." By the end of the war, even the legendary Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland acknowledged publicly that the Mustang was the superior aircraft. In private interrogations, he was even more blunt. The P-51 was the finest fighter of World War II. For the Germans who survived the air battles of 1944 to 1945, the conclusion was undeniable. The Bf-109G had begun the war as a symbol of German air dominance, feared across Europe and unmatched at altitude. But once the Mustang entered the fight, fully armed, fully fueled, and flown in overwhelming numbers, the Gustav was no longer the master of the sky. It was a relic fighting against a machine designed for a new kind of air war: fast, long-range, relentless, and unforgiving. Thus, when asked after the war which American aircraft truly defeated the Luftwaffe, not merely in the air, but strategically, psychologically, and irrevocably, German pilots gave an answer that echoed through every interrogation room. It was the Mustang.